Hello and welcome to the last day of the DevDesk event. I hope you have been enjoying the previous days and are still full of energy for this day of presentations. In this session, I want to talk about scalability, specifically what it means in regards of different users and personas. Scalability as a term is used wildly without a context and what it basically means to the person you're talking to. As I was saying, there's quite a many of different scenarios where you can use scalability. And in this session, I want to go through the setup in regards of what does it imply from a use case perspective, what are the requirements for each of these, and lastly, also, how does Qt fit into that and how does it help you to scale with your solutions? First of all, maybe we should have a look at the definition of scalability because that gives a glimpse on what we might be looking into here. So by Wikipedia, scalability is defined as scalability is the property of a system to handle a growing amount of work by adding resources to the system. That already adds a couple of follow-up questions. So first of all, what is the system for you in your context when you discuss scalability? What is the work? Work needs to be done by whom? Resources. What kind of resources are we talking to? And specifically, is adding resources usually what you want to do? Is adding in more actually solving your problem here? Another definition by Oxford Learner's Dictionary is a one which I personally prefer a bit more. It says, scalability is the fact that it is possible to adapt something to meet greater needs in the future. Possible to adapt basically implies that you need to do some preparational work. You need to start thinking of, okay, there might be changes. Meet greater needs does not imply automatically that you need to add something. A greater need can also imply that you basically have less resources or bigger constraints where still your solution needs to work on. Still, the question is, who is then taking care of these needs? And lastly, also needs in the future. That implies that you also need to somehow prepare for the things you haven't thought about yet. That can be new use cases coming up where you now still have a fixed environment, a fixed setup. And also it basically asks you to look more into the future and get into a forward thinking mode. So as you can recognize, the context is really key here when it comes to discussing scalability. And you need to look into which aspects are you basically taking care of, whom are we talking about. Different projects might need to scale also in different directions. So in this presentation, I want to separate it between vertical scaling and horizontal scaling. So first, let's discuss the vertical scaling, where you usually want to scale down or scale up. And let's talk about a couple of use cases in here. So I guess every one of us is looking to scale down the time to market. Whenever you have an idea, you start prototyping, designing, development, etc., and you want to get out to the market as fast as possible. You've seen many presentations already over the last days in regards of how our tools help you to bring teams closer together, and by that also speed up the overall product creation process. But that only talks about bringing out something in the first time. It's also about getting faster iterations in regards of either, well, verifying what you're doing and your updates before you release are getting tested. But also in the other aspect, once you have shipped something, you need to take care of that all updates all updates will not cause any regressions. And our Squish and Cocoa, our default offering from Qt, also has been extending significantly into that direction to also help in the DevOps case. Overall, the idea is still that whatever you have as a solution, you want to utilize as few resources as possible and get the maximum out of it. So in regards of scaling down, that would then be the memory footprint. And with Qt being a C++ framework and you get all the native performance and capabilities, that is the best fit to basically utilize or basically fulfill this requirement. And lastly, when it comes to scaling down, when you have a hardware product you want to ship, naturally you want to reduce the costs of the hardware, which is the bill of material. given that we now just recently also support the microcontrollers with Qt for MCU, you have yet another angle to look into that, because there's a huge gray area between low-end MPUs and high-end MCUs, where depending on your scenario, you are actually capable of switching between those, and by that also reduce your costs. Looking into the scaling up scenario, user experience is the first thing I would think about. When you look into user experiences or user interfaces 5 years ago compared to today, you see that there's much more coming in there, either from the content perspective, but also when it comes to animations, really getting the user into logically following up, etc., etc. And with our design tooling, which I have been seeing many presentations about already, we believe that we have the best offering for you, not only by Qt Design Studio, but also by the integrations towards the tools you have been using so far. Completely unrelated, or mostly unrelated, is the idea of connectivity. We are in a situation currently where everything you ship is connected to the internet or to the cloud in one aspect or another. So overall, you need to consider like, okay, how do I connect to the cloud? What methodologies do I use? There's different patterns, etc. And with Qt, we provide basically quite a lot there. Starting from REST APIs in Qt Network, or HTTP, CBOR for serialization, etc. That's all supported. But also when it comes to, let's call it default IoT protocols, like CoAP, OPC-UA, MQTT, all these are covered by our Qt M2M add-ons. And by connectivity, so far we have been talking about the channel to bring something out. But what you actually put through is data. And we all recognize that data is getting more and more these days. So the idea is also, how do you mitigate and manage data? When it comes to on-device itself, you need to make sure that you also collect data and store the data as efficient as possible, either by containers. You need to serialize the data before it gets sent over the connectivity or the communication channels, etc., etc. And with Qt, we have quite a lot of APIs which can help you in these needs. Lastly, I want to talk about the product development lifecycle. A decade ago, usually an embedded project looked like that. You had an idea, you made a device, and then you shipped it, and then you were done with it. These days, you really need to look into, okay, I have shipped the device, my device is connected, I need to provide security updates, quality updates, I want to have new features in regards of bringing in new requirements, new services, potentially also new revenue generation ideas, etc., etc. For all these updates, it's really important that you are basing that on a foundation which serves you as well. And with our strong binary compatibility reasons, we enable you to provide these updates also within Qt itself much easier. And in addition to that, now with the long-term support releases, we also help you as a user to use Qt for a much longer period. So that has been basically the vertical aspect. Now let's move a bit over to the horizontal aspects of scalability. I guess the big difference here is that when we talk about left to right, it's not like everybody is driving towards a certain goal. It's more like you have scenarios on either end, and you might actually recognize yourself sometimes more in the middle or leaning towards a certain area. There's also no right or wrong approach in itself. It's really like different solutions have different requirements. So depending on where you are on the scale, certain criteria or different criteria might be important for you. Let's start with looking into the platforms. In regards of Qt being a cross-platform framework and tooling, I guess that's a good place to start. So usually when you look into the platforms, you have the various areas between desktop, mobile, embedded, and MCU. So that's from scalability, you could also say you get lower in the hardware resources you are capable of doing. So that is basically covering like scalability across all these big platforms. Inside each of these, you also need to scale across various operating systems. So on the desktop, you do have Windows, Linux, Mac, the prominent mobile players, On the embedded side, it's the RTOSes or embedded Linux, etc. And if you aim for microcontrollers, usually you have the choice between a real-time operating system or you go bare metal. The Qt product portfolio in itself reflects that scenario quite easily. If you are looking to create an application, either on desktop or mobile, we do have Qt for application development as a product. If you aim to go towards a embedded device, then Qt for device creation is going to be your friend. And in addition to that, you also get all the capabilities of our application development. That is in respect of these days, if you have an embedded device, usually you also have a companion app for the users to get, well, more content, more features, better user experience overall, etc. And then also you have the desktop case for these kind of devices when it comes to maintenance efforts, etc., etc., remote control, remote UIs, etc. The MCU aspect, as a relatively fresh one, then scales down on the embedded side itself. And as such, it is a different product because it serves in the embedded segment, but not necessarily scales up to the desktop cases like I have been mentioning beforehand. You might be wondering why I haven't been mentioning cloud. So how would cloud fit into that? Initially, you would consider like this as something here as a yet another upscaling to the desktop. But facing reality, cloud is actually putting in another dimension to this whole topic. Because cloud is utilized in each of these. You do have lots of connectivities on desktop and mobile. I've been talking about how cloud connectivity is important on embedded and also on the MCU side. That is getting more and more traction these days. So that is why I didn't add it into the slide to either side, but it's still nothing like we would be ignored from our perspective, but it's rather incorporated into the target platform scenario. Another idea to look into scalability from the horizontal perspective is, are you aiming at a single product or looking for a product family? When we're talking about single products, that could be the one-off solutions I've been talking about previously, but also you might aim towards, well, having one high-end device or one device which then serves as basically, well, your main product. The other aspect, or on the other end of the scale, you do have product families, where you have from low end up to high end. Typical example could be mobile devices here, where certain vendors provide different kind of devices with different hardware capabilities, screen sizes, etc., etc. So in that aspect or in that context, requirements would then utilize, if you go for a single product, you are getting into the scenario of, once again, memory utilization and how can you reduce the cost, the actual hardware cost of the device, and how Qt fits into there. I've been talking about the analysis tools we do have beforehand, specifically also Qt for MCU, to then go to the next level down in regards of microcontrollers and how that can help you with your overall hardware costs. The more you go towards a product family, the more you get also, and especially in the embedded context, into a scenario that you need to support multiple operating systems. Naturally, Qt is a good fit here. I guess I don't need to go into many of the details here on this specific slide. If you aim for product families in itself, reusability is something you really want to look into. Even though there's the different configuration, either from the screen size or what the device is capable of doing. Can it do 3D animations, or do you need a static user interface because, well, CPU and GPU requirements are fairly low? You still, as the application developer, want to be capable of utilizing as much of the source code you have been using for one target or another. And with Qt Quick, QML, and Qt Quick controls, you are perfectly fit to that in that respect, that you can reuse components, and QML is perfectly made in regards of fulfilling that. Yet another angle is how you create or design application stacks in itself. For a very long time, people have been looking into the monolithic approach, where, well, you have one application which does everything, and all business logic, UIs, etc., all is located into the very same binary. I guess kind of inspired by the cloud development in itself, the idea popped up in regards of let's break it down, functional decomposition in regards of rather have small assets take care of certain tasks and then have these assets or workers basically communicate to each other via certain interfaces. So that is basically the microservices world where you basically break up everything as much as possible, which then comes with its own problems, which many are facing right now. I think overall, when it comes to the setup in respect of where we are moving for most scenarios, we are kind of moving back from the microservices, but still would like to keep a couple of things we have learned from the overall process. Either or are still perfectly valid depending on what your target is. However, the more and more you move towards the right hand side, data synchronization is important. If you do have multiple instances talking to the same data, you need to make sure if they don't override each other. You need to protect data and memory as much as possible from each other. As long as we're talking like on a local machine and inter-process wise, so multiple processes talking to each other, Qt Core basically provides everything you need in there in regards of IPC, memory locking, etc., etc. When on the next layer, when you look into the microservices architecture, you need to communicate, well, you need to have a method to have all the services or instances and processes talk to each other. That's where you basically start in utilizing either REST, which is basically a very common set in there, or other means. And then Qt comes with a couple of them. That could be CBOR, for instance, as a data exchange method, etc. But also the high-level protocols, MQTT, CoAP, etc., etc. The last aspect in here is then how do you not only exchange data, but also how do you invoke certain well, procedures, functions, etc. from a remote location, which is when remote procedure calls. gRPC being the most prominent in here, but if you're inside the Qt ecosystem, Qt Remote Objects is a perfect fit for you as well because it enables or already perfectly integrates into the UI flow with Qt Quick, etc., etc. Also, we are currently looking into how we can enable more underneath in the remote objects in regards of serialization, but also our RPC protocols in case you want to utilize something there on your own. Lastly, I want to talk about user interfaces and where the differences there are. When it comes to user interfaces, especially screen sizes, maybe that had been a better term, there is different things you need to consider. Especially if you go towards the smaller screen sizes, the problem for a designer is, or in general when it comes to user interfaces, abstracting from, you're creating your design, you use your experience, everything on your 30-inch monitor, and then in the end it needs to run on such a small screen. That abstraction is extremely hard. And rather how we see it better suitable, and especially in the embedded context, is accessibility to the target hardware for the UX designers themselves. So with Qt Design Studio, you get all the tools, but you are capable of verifying the user interfaces on the actual hardware. As your target screen size gets bigger, that barrier has kind of been moved away simply because, well, it's moving into the direction where you also are designing on, namely your monitor itself. If you look into the user interfaces themselves, then you get more space. One option is, well, to make just the content you already have had bigger, but that would at some point in time, I guess, break some UX considerations. And also it allows you to actually show more content. So that is when the overall idea with adaptive designs, that depending on the size and whether you want to resize things or not, you are showing different content. With Qt Quick, that's perfectly doable. And in that respect, that you can easily and declaratively describe like, okay, in these considerations, show this context, otherwise hide it, do not render it at all, etc. So there's also a big performance benefit in here if you just disable the rendering of these. Internationalization is also key in regards of, well, different languages have different sizes, etc. And there's quite a couple of things we are supporting here from the Qt perspective as well. 3D is something where I'd say it's kind of moving towards the smaller screens as well. But from the current standpoint, it's still something which fits more into the larger screen sizes and getting that integrated. With Qt Quick 3D, we provide everything basically to get you help started, and with the tooling surrounding that, also speed up the overall process to incorporate 3D content and then 3D user interface aspects into your application as well. Lastly is the high DPI scenario in that respect, that also resolutions scale up, not necessarily only the monitors. And it's a big hassle for many if you need to basically create your user interfaces twice because, well, the underlying operating system decides it should now basically scale up everything by a factor of 2, like it is on the Mac hardware. But for instance, also by a scale factor of 1.25, which is fractional scaling on the Windows side. So Qt takes that pain away from you. If you have the assets in the best resolution, we can do the scaling for you, or you specify your own scaled images. But also when it comes to controls, Qt takes care of that aspect for you perfectly well. With that having said, I hope I was able to give a couple of overview on what scalability means in different scenarios. I just mentioned a couple of them, but I think overall Qt is a fit for most, if not of all of them. And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions and enjoy the rest of the day.